Facepalm America, I'm Beowulf Rockland. FacepalmAmerica.com is where you can find, as usual, more information about the show, listen to past episodes, and connect with us on social media. I grew up in a suburb. You probably grew up in a suburb, too. That's actually where most Americans live these days. It's an interesting place, and it has an interesting past. And it has an interesting and perhaps not so auspicious future. And the reasons how we got into the realm of suburbia in this great land of ours are interesting and maybe speak to some of the things that we need to change in this country. And so I wanted to have a discussion about this. Our guest, therefore, is Benjamin Herold. He's a journalist covering the public education system. He reports for Education Week, PBS NewsHour, NPR, and many more. And he's the author of Disillusioned, 5 Families and the Unraveling of America's Suburbs. Benjamin Herold, welcome to Facepalm America. Thanks so much for being here today.
Thanks for having me.
First, let's talk about the definition of a suburb. Is it still just a less densely populated area outside an urban metropolis, or has the definition expanded or shifted in any way over the past generation or two?
You're starting with the hard questions. It's actually really challenging to define a suburb, and that's part of why we're so bad at talking about them. So how I would answer that is that the first and most important thing that we have to do is kind of shed our popular mythology that suburbs are just these kind of all single family houses with a nice lawn and a picket fence and a good public school down the street. Like, that myth is very powerful in America. But the reality of American suburban communities vary widely. And so what I do in the book is I follow 5 different suburbs that are really at different stages of their developmental arc. From a new ex-urban community outside of Dallas, where you see these 5,000, 6,000 square foot McMansions still going up in ranch land, next to longhorn cattle still grazing by the side of the road, all the way to the other end of the spectrum in Compton, California, which was, this kind of prototypical bedroom community back in the 30s and 40s, all white up until the 1950s. Bush family actually lived there for a brief period of time. But now, it's been decades since we've thought of it as a suburb at all. And so, this kind of spectrum really kind of helps us understand what suburbia really is in America right now.
Yeah, exurbs. I've always wondered exactly where I live, because I live in a community that is in Southern Oregon in the Rogue Valley that is like, really, if you look at the totality of it, it's really kind of 100 miles from anything else that's like a big area, and yet I live like in a single family home neighborhood outside in between a couple of different towns. So is that a far exurb? Is it a suburb? It's really hard to tell. And yet, like, these are the kinds of places where really most people live. I grew up in Marin County, California, which is just north of San Francisco, and that was a really established before World War II. I mean, people were commuting into San Francisco from Marin County, in the teens and 20s, 100 years ago. You grew up in a suburb outside of Pittsburgh. Tell us about that and what your experience there was.
Yeah, so my parents moved into Penn Hills, Pennsylvania. It's 10 miles east of downtown Pittsburgh in 1976, and I was born a couple months later. And so, in many ways, I've had this experience that was what we kind of stereotypically think of as the suburban experience. I'm white, my family was white, we were kind of upwardly mobile, working middle class. And so I got a lot of benefits, and my family got a lot of benefits from living there. There were cheap mortgages, there were good tax breaks, there was generally new infrastructure, and there was a really good public school system. And part of why that was good is because, I learned, I got to take advanced placement courses and had a lot of opportunity available to me. But there were also these small moments that came up again and again. And one that I think of all the time, especially after writing this book, was when I was in 3rd grade. I was the kind of kid who would get bored and distracted, and I would start drawing on my desk. And instead of punishing me, what my teacher actually did was bring in her typewriter from home. And she said, Ben, when you get bored, don't draw on your desk. You just go back and you do whatever you want to do on the typewriter. And so I started I started a class newspaper. It was my first newspaper job, up to date with Room 38. Nice. And so that kind of opportunity and grace and like cultivating gifts, that was really a big part of what suburbia was all about. But I graduated high school in 1994. And I left. I didn't think twice about it. It was 3/4 white. I thought it was the most boring place in America. I couldn't wait to get out. I wanted to see the real world. And I really didn't think much about the suburbs for about 20 years. And then in 2015, all of these headlines started coming out of Penn Hills, this town that I'd grown up in. And all of them revolved around the school system, which is a 4,000 student district that had somehow run up $172 million debt. And the ripple effects of that were just washing over the community. You saw teachers getting furloughed, programs getting slashed, budgets getting cut, property taxes going up, home values stagnating. And so it made me realize two things. So one, that this kind of opportunity, benefit, this generous social contract that my white family had received from suburbia was no longer happening, no longer available to the families that moved in. And many of those families were African American. The public schools there were now 2/3 Black. And so not only were they not getting the generous social contract that my family had enjoyed, they were in effect on the hook for paying for all of the opportunities families like mine had already extracted.
It's interesting. I feel such a commonality with you because you and I were born and graduated from high school in the same year. And I feel like so many of the same processes were going on in Marin, but because of the ambient, wealth in the San Francisco Bay Area, I think the same impact has not been visited upon my former home as has been visited upon yours. But I think mine is the exception as far as I can tell, because really there is far less ambient wealth in these suburbs, like the one that you grew up in. And I'm just wondering, because the process for building them, as I understand, was driven so much by, to be honest, racism and white flight and white families moving out of urban centers and into the suburbs, and it was made pretty cushy for them, for us. And yes. Is there a similar white flight now out of the suburbs now that there has been a demographic adjustment?
There has been for the past 20, 30 years, really even going back to around 1980. What we've seen is the dramatic diversification of suburbia that we've really missed. We're so grounded in our own mythologies that we kind of haven't really recognized how sweeping these demographic changes have been, to the point that inside suburban public schools now, white children are a minority. And so these demographic changes have swept through everywhere. So what we saw historically was that, all of those benefits and that kind of generous social contract that you and I received and our families received in suburbia, part of the reason that was possible is because we were pushing the true costs off onto a future generation. We weren't really paying to repair and maintain the infrastructure, being a prime example of this. And so eventually the bills come due. And when the bills come due, they come due in a big way because all that stuff was built almost overnight. All of that, sewers, sidewalks, public schools, streetlights, all of it was built almost overnight. And so it all needs repairs at once. And so what we see, have seen over and over again is that families like mine leave. Right when the bills are about to come due, we go to the next ring out. And we start a new suburban community, one ring further from downtown, and kind of restart the cycle over without looking back at who's following us into that community. And often the families who follow us in are Black, brown, poor, immigrant, looking for that same generous social contract. Yeah. And instead, what they find is this, essentially that they're on the receiving end of this kind of Ponzi scheme that's now starting to fall apart, in part because we've kind of run out of space, right, literally and figuratively, to just keep running away. We can't keep building further and further out into the countryside. Partly, the demographic numbers just don't support it. The transformation of suburbia demographically is, such that the numbers just don't work anymore. And also land use patterns are changing, climate change, housing market, et cetera. So there's all these reasons that are kind of forcing many families, white, working and middle class families who historically would have fled suburbs to move to a community one ring further out and avoid all of the stuff that comes with this demographic change, now being stuck in place and having to reckon with it. And that's what that's what I argue in Disillusioned is really driving a lot of this tension and conflict we see at suburban school board meetings in particular.
It's interesting to think how the whole Moms for Liberty dynamic plays out as a result of this, because I really feel that, politics and culture are downstream of economics, and it's a whole other conversation, but it makes me think about why specifically that came into place. You certainly can see that the racism which drove the suburbs into being has not gone away entirely by any stretch of the imagination. It's also interesting to observe that, to an extent, not only are whites moving out of the suburbs to exurbs, but to an extent, some of them are also moving back into urban centers and gentrifying those places. So both phenomena are occurring at the same time.
In many places, right. And Pittsburgh is a great example of that. Chicago and Atlanta, which I also featured in the book as well. And so part of what you see is, again, that part of that dynamic is what's driving the diversification of suburbia as well.
Right.
So the woman that I follow I follow 5 families, one in each of these communities outside Chicago, Dallas, Atlanta, Pittsburgh, and LA. And so the mom who I met in Pittsburgh is an African-American mom. And she actually bought the house 3 doors down from my childhood home in 2018. After my family was entirely gone. And when I got to know her, she was like, look, I didn't even really want to move to the suburbs. I grew up in this kind of like intact historic Black community in downtown Pittsburgh.
Yeah.
But over time, our family was pushed out because of the gentrification. So we saw this kind of like 10-year window when Pittsburgh lost almost 10% of its Black population. And she was part of that displacement. So she ends up in the suburbs kind of on the hook for all of this stuff that happened in the 70s and 80s when she didn't even necessarily want to be there in the first place. And that's part of this disillusionment that I think we're seeing, in suburbs all across the country where, families come to suburbia for all of these reasons, many of which revolve around their kids and their dreams and their hopes for the future. And then when that gets pulled out from under you, when the rug starts to kind of disappear, like it's very upsetting for a lot of families and for a lot of different reasons. And now, because of the demographic changes, because it's not as easy to just keep moving away further out, you see those dreams colliding more and more.
You mentioned earlier that the bills are coming due for these communities, especially in terms of infrastructure. How are communities across the country responding to it? Are they able to pay them? What strategies are they using to try and stay afloat when things are starting to fall apart?
Yeah, it's a really, really delicate dance for a lot of communities to do. And so I'll give you a couple examples. So, I look at the kind of Dallas-Fort Worth area and one of the, kind of the successive rings of development northward into Collin. And so there's a town there called Plano, and it was kind of like the classic prototypical suburb in the 70s and 80s. It drew tons and tons of people and families there for the schools. And then it started to age and started to get a little more diverse. And so Plano, much like Marin County, it was an area where you have all of this wealth. Toyota's, established headquarters there. There's there's like a robust industrial tax base. So in many ways, it has many advantages. So the town started saying, okay, we're going to develop a new comprehensive plan that's going to be about sustainability, diversity, adding pockets of density, starting to rely on mass transit. And people freaked out. There was this whole recall movement. There was like this kind of backlash that came out on the council. The mayor, who was Black, was accused of trying to turn Plano into, quote, another Harlem. It was just all of this backlash against that kind of effort to deal with the problem. And then what you saw actually in the community further outside, where the family, who's a white family who I end up following, they left Plano and ended up going into one of these far ex-urban communities that's far wealthier and far whiter, and thinking that they were in this place that was going to kind of at least be intact long enough for their kids to get through the public schools. And what they find is like it ends up in this kind of wicked budget crunch from some of these same issues. And when I started talking to the town leaders, they told me just this incredible story of saying they kind of knew as early as like 2000 that this was coming. Like, we know we're not really paying full freight. And so they had these planning and zoning commissions, and expert after expert would come and say, listen, this mix that you have of all residential with large lots and no real tax base and having low taxes and abundant services, like you can't keep that up forever. You either have to grow or you have to raise taxes. And the community was like, not at all. It was so contentious that they had to move. This is a tiny town of like 5,000 people. They had to move the Planning and Zoning Commission meeting from the town, from City Hall into the fire station so they could set up more chairs in the bay because everyone was so mad. And they ended up voting out. They ended up like rolling back this plan. So they ended up issuing more debt instead of raising taxes or, allowing growth. And the town ended up voting out every single council member who had voiced any support at any point in time for that. So, there's a lot of pressure against constructive ways of kind of proactively trying to address this dynamic.
It is so frustrating to hear that and to know that the political pathways that are currently open to any sort of, I mean, one, just maintaining what there is,